we shall send to the moon, 240,000 miles away, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth.
Appreciate that. Dan is a retired aerospace engineer who worked through the golden years of America's space program. He graduated from high school in Fargo. I got to read a wonderful article about his first rocket experience. If you don't know that, you should read that article. And he received his college education from Northwood Institute of Technology in California. He has degrees in aeronautical and astronautical engineering. Wow, okay? And this era brought in math and science, I guarantee you, into our curriculum. During his tenure on Project Apollo, he developed the operational mission plans for the first 2 launches of the Saturn V moon rocket, which was personally sanctioned by Dr. Van Broughton, and he will talk to you more about that. The rocket engineer. Dan was part of the flight operation team in Houston during Apollo 11. Also, he supported 12 and 13, as well as Project Viking, the first landing on the moon. Very impressive, Dan. Subsequent to that, he worked in the scientific intelligence and missile defense field, was chief engineer in NORAD at the Cheyenne Mountain Space Defense Project. Finally, his career right now has been the design and development of an international airport in Asia. I'm not wanting to take a whole lot of time. I give you our speaker for the day.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fisher. I do want to thank you for the good introduction. I also want to thank the members of the board and Rob and his crew for the diligence that they went through to make this happen. And so again, many thanks. It's really a fine job. Today is July the 20th. That's 50 years exactly from the day we landed. What's more, it's not a day that we picked by accident or the time of this meeting, because in about 2 minutes was the exact time on this day that the word came down. The Eagle had landed. So anyway, we're going to kind of look through, in hindsight, to Apollo through our rear view mirror. And so the point of that is, we've had enough time to understand it. It's time that we look back and find some insight behind sight. I'm not here to give you the traditional history. You know that. You've seen the movie, you've seen all that stuff. What isn't ever told yet is behind the scenes stuff that I think you'll find sort of interesting, or at least I hope you do. So anyway, that's the point of this. And what I have to offer you today is the behind the scenes, things that NASA doesn't know about, and I'm sure they don't know the whole story. This is a partially or mostly true story. Okay? Because I don't know the whole story. The program is far too big for anybody to know the true story. NASA doesn't know the true story. Okay? It's that kind of a deal. After all, I mean, how are you going to manage 400,000 people at a minimum that worked on it with the disciplines and everything running in parallel? How are you ever going to get a handle on that? You're not. So that's what this is about. So be prepared for things you don't know or hadn't heard about. So, if you look back through history, it seems like man has always had an infatuation for the darn moon. It's insatiable, you know. I mean, we've romanticized over it. We've written stuff about it. We've created superstitions about it, and we've all measured our time about it. All of our dreams have somehow or another included going there at some time. And we saw that as a great enterprise. Well, that's kind of a strange description. What am I talking about whenever I'm talking about a great enterprise? They all seem to have a couple of common characteristics. One, in the beginning, it's kind of like a crazy venture. You're mad, you're out of your mind. Or if it turned out okay, it becomes a defining moment, right? Depends how it turns out, how the enterprise works. Kind of take, for instance, the wheel, who is first invented. Yeah, how many of them are you going to build? Who's going to buy that? What do you got in mind for that? How much is that going to change things? Or about the guys that decided to sail west. Everybody in their right mind knew there's dragons out there and you're going to fall off the edge of the earth and that's going to be it and things. Everybody knew that. Well, how did that turn out? A little closer to home. How about your grandparents that decided to sell everything they knew, stuff it into a wagon and head west? The idea in mind, they're going to start a new nation. It's going to be kind of difficult now, ain't it? How did that turn out? Or the Wright brothers decided to put a few bicycle parts together and try to put a flying machine together. That's kind of weird now. Or, to top it off, the guy who decided to climb up on top of an unproven rocket for the very first time to try to get into space. And so every one of these were clearly massive, massive challenges. Every one of them were turning points in history, and they were clearly advanced civilization by leaps and bounds. I'm going to tell you what I'm about to tell you. Okay, so we classify Apollo as one of the great adventures. I'm going to tell you that I think it's the greatest adventure that our time has ever seen. I think history's going to treat this very well. I really do. After all, it was an impossible task. It had an impossible schedule to it. We had a very pitiful set of tools to use to do it. There wasn't any reference base that we could particularly rely on to get her done. We had to develop the technology on the side. We actually had to build a space center. We didn't know what it should look like even from the beginning. I mean, we started from zero, absolute zero. But you look at it, I think this is the crown jewel of anything that the world has ever seen. After all, it is the first and only extraterrestrial event for mankind. It's kind of a big deal. But we got her done. And on the very first try. That's the miracle out of the whole thing. Nothing, in my mind, has changed the world so much. Now that's one thing that's kind of missing, and I'm going to end this way. I'm going to tell you what it's done for us. So you got to sit still for about another 2 hours to hear it. Okay. Why in the world did we ever do this anyway? I mean, thousands of years have gone by when nothing happened, and all of a sudden, boom, we want to do it. Well, you've heard what the politicians have told you. You've seen what Kennedy told us. We didn't do it because it was there to explore. We didn't do it there because it was a new frontier. We didn't do it because it was hard. None of that stuff. Or for the technological challenge. None of that crap. That was merely a front to demilitarize the issue. The truth of the matter is, we did it to try to counter a Russian threat, and that was a real threat. We did it to develop a space and a rocket technology. We knew it had military application. We did it to prevent the colonization of space, which the Russians were setting out and even claimed they were going to do. We also did it to restore America's really shattered confidence. So, the reason why we did it was out of fear. Fear. It wasn't out of patriotism or anything like that. It scared the tar out of us. You can kind of blame the Russians for this. Of course, you knew that. Started back in 1957. So our motivation was very much like a shotgun wedding. Motivation by circumstance. Okay? 1957, all of a sudden we woke up one morning and got shaken really hard by this Vostok rocket that was plastering all over the news that the Russians had put a Sputnik in space, a little chirping communications satellite. Our response to this was pretty dismal. We had at least a year's worth of serial failures. One rocket after another can't get off the pad. It just blew up. That's all we could do. Well, the Russians took note of that. They published that paper in Pravda, which was in a newspaper that was read all over the world. Americans, a bunch of monkeys, playing high dollar firecrackers. And so that didn't sit well with all, at all, not at all. 1961 came by, and there was a meeting at the UN where the ambassador, our ambassador, was talking about the good deal that democracy offered. Well, Khrushchev happened to be there. Everybody knows who Khrushchev is, right? The Russian premier. He had enough of that. He got up, took his shoe off, pounded on the podium and said, "We're going to bury you." We took that pretty literal, okay? That's no communication satellite up there, that's a darn space ball. Well, that's what caused John Kennedy to say, today we're going to send astronauts to the moon before the end of the decade and return them safely to home. It was a really bad choice, really bad choice. It was a daunting challenge, it was a magnificent undertaking, no question about it. But it was the very worst time he could have ever picked to go to the moon. That's because if you'd asked people who understood the problem, they would have told him, no, at the end of this decade, the sun is in this most busy period of solar flares. Okay? And so those will cook any astronaut that's not protected or anything else like that, yet you want us to land right in the middle of it. So and the call goes out. We've got to form a team moon, I'll call it. You all know Werner von Braun, the German rocket scientist that we got out from World War II that headed up Poonamundi and the rocket program for them. Well, he had an idea about rockets to be built. He needed a complete degree of freedom with no interruption. And he says, I'll get her done if you turn it over to me. All right, we're going to let you lead this thing. And so, so they immediately named Marshall Space Flight Center after him, which used to be an arsenal. And so he's the one that had the Saturn V in mind, right from the very beginning. We immediately got busy and got a bunch of good, healthy young guys. Over the course of Apollo, we had about 55 astronauts that said, if you can build it, we'll fly it. We'll get on it. Well, no, not a problem. Destiny's choice for the man who did land on the moon was Neil Armstrong. Okay, he was on the second round set of picks of astronauts. Not to leave any of the heavyweights out, this man here is, he was an old Marine. He was the head of the flight director in Houston. He knew how to motivate people in a bad place. He's the guy that coined the phrase on Apollo 13, failure is not an option. And it wasn't. So that's the team short of the 400,000. Now that 400,000 is probably the steady state. The working environment was really weird. People would come with aspirations in mind and find out, no, it was a little bit more than what they could handle, and they'd just zip right on through and nobody missed them. I mean, they'd come and go within a year. So they were clearly replaced, but I think as far as NASA saw it, they probably saw 400 names. See, at the first time, they also had a very complicated but risky and really orthodox scheme to get there. And that's called the Lunar Rendezvous. And we've got another one of these, but I'll do this one very briefly. But you'd always launch from the Earth and target it to intercept a moon who is sitting right back here at launch time and move forward in time around in its own orbit at the time we would almost hit it. And there was not a direct targeting. So the moon would actually grab it, turn it, and if nothing else could happen, everything else was a failure on the vehicle, it would bring you right back to Earth on an Earth intersecting path. Pretty cool. That was an awful lot to take on. See, the Russians were just going to do just like shooting ducks. You're just going to go straight, you're going to land, and you're going to come straight home. That's what they were going to do. That was the original idea with Werner von Braun. But I'll tell you about that story a little bit later. Okay, and we're going to get ahead of ourselves if I don't stop and tell you this one. Everybody says, talk about Apollo. No, can't talk about Apollo. You can't talk about Apollo without going all the way back to Mercury. Okay? And you can't talk about Gemini without talking about that either. So you've got to talk about all three, because it was now a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 kind of a situation. So we don't want to leave these guys out. Now just talk about Apollo, which really begins way over here. You'd leave a lot of people out of history that was very essential. Project Mercury had to develop the rocketry and the guidance that went with it. It had to develop the life support system. Remember, it wasn't putting some good coveralls on an astronaut and putting him out there because the slower flare might cook him. No. It turned out the answer was, you got to line everything with solid gold. Yeah. Even the inside of the spacesuit was made out of solid gold. Every instrument package was lined with gold. Every habitable part of the spacecraft for the astronauts was lined with gold. That might have had something to do while they devalued our dollar. Okay, so obviously the president didn't know any of that. He almost decided to cancel the thing, and he actually had some chit chat with Khrushchev. Why don't we do this together? Okay, let's stop this. They'd almost in agreement. Kennedy got killed and never went any further. So he actually had his second thoughts at about this point, once he began to find out the implications of his decision. Excuse me. Okay, so now you also had to develop a communication system, a worldwide one, and a computing infrastructure. We actually had to go to IBM and say, hey, can you guys build a computer that's smaller than the size of a refrigerator? Those things don't fit on a spacecraft very well. So this is where one of the good examples of starting at ground zero. So the proof of what they had to do during Mercury was prove that man could survive a launch and reentry. It was a medical issue as much as anything. Can you get through the Van Allen belt, which is a radiation belt, and still come home, still sane? Okay? And so man can experience no illegal effects afterward. Now, if we can do that, now we can proceed. Okay, but that's the whole purpose of that one. Gemini says, well, it had one thing to do, to prove that the free return trajectory worked. If you could get her done. That takes them a lot of precision in the targeting. I know that. And you also had to really have some good docking techniques. The Russians didn't care about that. They just had one guy in, one capsule, went direct, both directions, straight shot, no problem. So here we were behind, complicating it about as much as could be complicated. Here we had to prove that man could withstand a long-term 0 G's. We knew he could go ahead and work because of Gemini, but could he actually work? Okay, and could he actually do that long enough that he would be a week or 10 days, 2 weeks in orbit? Apollo was now get her done. Okay, so all the rocket development, we should have had one here by the mid-60s. That was the goal. Put her together, get her done, prove that the whole brand new space vehicle, which was the Schneider 5, the only one with enough muscle to throw us out there and get us there. Also, does the guidance work on the free return? How about the lander vehicle? Oh, we never had a chance to mess with it. So this is the very first time where Apollo itself took off big chunks. All right. Some of the tools I told you about. Pretty sorry looking, huh? I mean, I'm not kidding. The first 5 years of my professional life, I did a lot of work on a slide rule. And that Univac 1108, you generally didn't do a computer run unless you had no input errors on it. It cost you $1,500 an hour to run it. In today's dollars, that's about 20 times. See, that's in the $20,000 an hour to run it. So there was a premium for guys who could submit runs and did not make any input mistakes and have to try again. There's some of that what caused a lot of the revolving door. All right, this freedom calculator. And I know some of you are old enough to have seen this all over the place, even here in Woodward. What's neat about this one? It's got a square root sign on it. It'll take a square root. Now, if you ever try to take a square root sign by manual, that's a pear. That's a bear. Okay? And so just to do trajectory work, people just didn't want to do it. Well, the kid from Fargo says, I'll give it a shot. Okay. So at any rate, this one here is the first electronic calculator that TRW ever bought in Houston. It cost about $2,800 and $60, so that's in the teens, easily. But that showed up about 1967. I started doing my interplanetary work on that one. That was a doll. I mean, you had to sign up time on that one. Because it would take a square root, it would do logarithms, it had 12 significant figures of accuracy. We thought we died and gone to heaven. But as far as Apollo was concerned, it was a done deal already. All right. There were no textbooks per se. Yes, there were textbooks out there in the universities, but they were in the theory of astronomy. To actually do targeting and things like that, no, you had to figure that out. So, a lot of guesswork going on, a lot of trial and error going on. When I said engineering on the fly, exactly it. So it didn't really matter who you hired. The PhD didn't know any more than the guy with the bachelor's degree. That's the only reason I got hired. I had a course in it. I'm not kidding. That's really the reason why I got there. So, there was this work environment that I mentioned. I showed up in 1965 right at the peak at Gemini. Nobody was actually working Apollo at that instant time. And so what I ran into, they were still in the process of finishing putting buildings together at the Manned Spacecraft Center, now Johnson Space Center. So there was a big sense of urgency. It was just, you could cut it with a knife, it seems like. It was kind of like what I envisioned in the Manhattan Project to develop the atomic bomb. It's that kind of a deal. People were coming all over. It was chaotic. People rushing in and out like it was a gold rush or something. No. Everybody had questions. Nobody had answers. Everything was needed yesterday. That's about where it was. You weren't going to last very long if you expect to work 8 hours a day. It just wasn't in the equation. The big revelation to me was there was no tutorship. Everybody had to accept a problem and make it go away. That means to take ownership. Oh, that was a kind of hard one to take. And you were given all the responsibility that you were willing to accept. The only condition was is if you ran into something you couldn't solve, you had to try to search it out with other people of more seniority than you had, and see if you couldn't hammer it out. Oh, well, that was. I'm going to save this one for a minute. Okay. So I asked for the 2 Saturn V's. That's what I did. It says, you mean nobody is doing this? There's two major ones that are attached directly to Werner von Braun. I want that. I want those. I didn't know what I was talking about, but I wanted those. Okay. And I said, that'd be the first 500 series launch. The policy was if you had 2 decent flights on anything, you'd put a guy on it. I said, all right, I can take the sister flight too. He said, are you sure? Yeah. If I can do one, I can do 2. That's the way I figured it. If I couldn't do any, no matter. I had nothing else to lose. I was just a low guy on the totem pole. See? If it worked out, great. So that's the attitude I could take with it. You know, you had a lot of guys that was coming experienced and would not take the risk. They just couldn't do it. And I can understand it. So it became real clear the gravity of what we were doing, because we said what we do here is going to define our generation. One of the hard parts was the realization that we had to teach NASA how to be NASA. They were bureaucrats, every one. I mean, they had places, things to build, they had contracts to issue, you know, and contracts to monitor, et cetera, et cetera. And so a big premium on documentation. And so we had to sit there and actually tutor them what the answer was, and answer their other questions in between. So they always had a priority of anything we did to answer their question. So this lasted for quite some time, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Okay. The political pressure was unbelievable. What I've got shown here is the same thing in the Russian Space Agency as it was NASA. Strange thing. Both agencies had the same mentality. They had no problem establishing an unrealistic goal. Their goal was every bit as unrealistic as what Kennedy did. They were willing to push it beyond the limits of people. They didn't have any problem compromising the mission. They really didn't. They were willing to take the risk of experiencing a failure. And being at the top of the ladder, we can always assign blame somewhere else and explain away the cause. Well, that's exactly what happened on Apollo 1. Exactly what happened. They put schedule over safety. Got a little complacent about their quality assurance. They had some really risky cost reduction measures to reduce manpower and time against it. And they says, get her out of here. We got to get it to the Cape. Let's go. Now that was built by North American, who's not in business anymore. But it was North American's fault. Now you can whip somebody just so hard and he's going to leave a socket wrench where it ain't supposed to be. Okay. Anyway, if that didn't get us, there'd been lost something else that did, because that had about 600 or 700 design flaws in it. Okay. That's how hard they were pushing North American to get it out. Well, we all know that bit them real hard. That's where we burned up 3 astronauts on the pad. Okay? And there, the philosophy was just design and build, test a little bit, then go to the next step until you can design a string. Okay? So this was the very first on the pad test and things like that. There you are. Well, about that same time, and I'm not quite sure of my dates, but it was real close to the same time, the same thing happened over in Russia. The guy on the left is Yuri Gagarin. He was the first astronaut in space, but at this particular point in time, he was head of the astronaut corps. He was best buddies with Komarov. Together, they were going to validate, if you will, the Block 2 spacecraft. They found hundreds of errors in that design itself. That didn't really matter to the Politburo. It says, no, you're going to fly. You're going to fly. Sure enough, disaster occurred exactly as these guys here knew it would. Yuri actually says, I will take this mission. I'm in charge here. He says, no, my destiny is if I die, I die. And I'm flying this. Sure enough, he died. He burned up in injury. So that mysterious death showed up a little bit later. But let me back up a second. We recorded that death and the dying gasp of that reentry from a spy station we had in Turkey. And so we followed that thread. We found out that Yuri actually went to the Kremlin and got Brezhnev by the collar, shook him down, put him up against the wall and said, you don't do that. A couple of weeks later, he disappeared. We don't know what happened to Yuri. At any rate, we do know that they made the Russian equivalent of von Braun the scapegoat. They basically worked him to death. He really did. He fixed the problem. And he was building their M1 moon rocket whenever he fell and died of a heart attack. But anyway, super guy, really super guy. If you want to find out about him and von Braun and compare, go up to Hutchinson, Kansas, and they've got a little museum where they really treat, honestly, the Russian program with the U.S. program. Great to see. Okay, let's get down to business. My part in all of this, and I showed up at TRW Space Technology Labs in Houston in September of 1965. As I already mentioned, I signed up to be responsible for the first 2 Saturn V's. So it does have, these are the mission patches. It has no astronaut patches or names on them because it's unmanned. I thought I'd never see the lunar mission. Never really expected to. I figured that had been staffed from the very beginning. That's where you put the heavyweights on, right? And it's well on its way. Okay, and it was on its way. But as I was transitioning over to work some interplanetary stuff, they called me back. And they says, Mission Control doesn't have any guidance, any procedures to monitor the landing and know when to abort or to land. We want you to go figure that out from home. So I go to the Manned Spacecraft Center to be locked up on the 3rd floor for about 6 months to do that. More to that a little bit later. Well, when we flew that mission, it flew way down range of the target. It was about 18 miles off. And they says, hey, you're the guidance freak. Can you take and do a trajectory reconstruction to tell us where we landed? Yeah, I did that. And that was a little over 18 miles. Okay. And so, along comes Apollo 13. You know the problem. So the real question of me says, hey, all we've got is a limb for the lunar lander to get the spacecraft back on a free return trajectory. What can we do? And I said, well, you're not going to use the limb to do that. I mean, certainly not in a guided sort of way, but you can power it up if you're willing to try to do it manually. Okay? And so we concocted a scheme of some star coordination where you line it up, you hold those, well then you'll probably be okay. Well, that was successful, right? Great. That's the only part they left out of the darn movie. Yeah. It's really true. All right. So at any rate, so I went off and I did targeting for the advanced missions. Those were the ones that was in the higher latitudes, the mountainous areas, the harder to get to. If you know how to land it, then you know how to do this, and then the other to get the guidance to do it. And I'll take you to school a little bit on the guidance scheme a little bit later. All right. I'm getting a lot of promises here, aren't I? All right. So this is sort of like, how did you get from Fargo to there? Well, what you're looking at there is the physics class in Fargo in 1958. Okay. And I don't know how anybody knew about superintendent of schools was Peterson, yeah, there we are. Excuse me. Anyway, Von Braun was starting to go around the schools and encouraging pursuit of technical degrees, particularly if it had a space connection with it, okay? And my older brother was already in school at Northrop Institute of Technology, and I said, hey, why don't we build us a rocket like Von Braun was? People in Oklahoma City were sending them and all this stuff. They were mid 2 feet, 3 feet long, about 2.5 inches diameter. That's about all they were doing. So I called out Jim, and he was a part of Pacific Rocket Society. He says, oh, make it out of chromoly steel, stuff it full of ground up metal, zinc and sulfur, stuff it, and you might core it up the middle so it'll burn this way instead of end to end, and you're in business. That made me look pretty smart. Okay? So that's what we did. That's my brother Jim. He's sitting back there getting kind of red around the gills. But at any rate, this is launch day, November the 17th, 1956. Well, this was infinitely successful. That thing went up into some high clouds, and that's the last we saw of it. As far as we know, it's somewhere in Beaver County, but not sure. So we had launched a second one, which I was not a part of that. I don't know quite why I wasn't, but anyway, a different story. Next thing you know, the feds show up because what's this crap about you guys shooting rockets up in the airline corridors? That's the days of DC-3s, remember? Remember DC-3s? Yeah, they'd fly about 8,000 or 10,000 feet. Well, the clouds were higher than that, and it was still burning, see? Anyway, so they put the quietus on us. So I wasn't a real popular critter in Fargo for quite some time. So I'm kind of glad that I graduated and got the tar out of there, but it was the right thing to do. See, you might appreciate that the chromoly steel came from a locomotive, a steam engine. You know, the choo-choos. We found that at Racine Metals. And so I've already mentioned the fuel and all that. So anyway, so Racine was responsible as we were. He's not here to defend himself anyway, so that's where. So anyway, this little incident really worked out because that was my first meeting with Werner von Braun, 1958. He was going around, he was in Oklahoma City, and he was encouraging people to go to college and take aeronautical stuff. Well, I went, I got invited to there, and I went, and I think it was this guy here, Paul, who went with me. He's dead and gone now. But at any rate, he was the one that I think went with me. So, almost 10 years later, I met him a second time. This was in November of 1966 in Marshall Space Flight Center. And quite a bit of difference before him. See, this was before NASA became NASA. Cheap suit, everything. Good office, expensive suit. Anyway, he's the guy that already had this one designed, built, ready. Unbelievable. I don't know how many of you have been to any of the centers to see any of these things laying down on the, they take up a city block. Okay. At any rate, what I was to do is to go briefing to this document. That's the operational trajectory for the first flight of that vehicle. I was really appalled that nobody else at TRW went with me. I didn't understand it. No big deal. Okay. I think I briefed what he wants. Well, it took a funny turn. He began to ask me a couple of questions that were a little hard to answer. This one here was a full-out, high-risk launch that NASA had created where we're not going to build a little, test a little, build a little bit, test some more. No. String it up, put it on the path, let's test it all at one time. But they didn't want to do a full duration burn to keep it, or else it would go heliocentric, which means in orbit around the sun. No? Okay, so keep it in Earth orbit. And here's the objectives and away we go. Well, and one of the other objectives associated with that was to turn the spacecraft such that it always faced the sun from one angle to heat the heat shield up. Hot on one side, cold on the sun side. And on the way back, then light the engine, which would have been this one, and slam it into the Earth and then a return entry. That was a stress test on the heat shield. Okay, so to keep it from going heliocentric, we actually turned it and fly it backwards. And then it fired it up backwards where it had to turn around, burn off a lot of fuel to reduce the orbit and then come back again. All right. So he asked me, he said, well, what happens if the thing decides to pinch down instead of come around this way instead of this way? I had thought of that. I said, well, I think we'll probably lose it. I just downright honest with it. Okay. And they said, oh, okay, now how do we prevent it? I said, well, at this particular point, I'm fairly knowledgeable about the MIT guidance package. I said, I think we can go to Time Base 7, put a flag in there and force it up. Oh, okay, that works. He said, what if that's a little hard to do? I said, well, I guess we wouldn't do it. But he says, how else would we do it? I said, well, we can make sure that the thing is really aligned. The guidance platform is really aligned at the point of ignition, and maybe it would go. How can we be sure of that? Well, we can. He said, where's that bird occur? And I said, off Ascension Island, which is almost on the coast of Africa. So he said, we don't have no tracking ship out there, do we? No, sir, we don't. He said, yeah, but if you got one that's got S-band capability, we can do it. Oh, okay. So that was the way that conversation went, and that's the way it ended. At the end of that meeting, he asked the NASA guys, do we have any more questions for this young fellow? Quiet as mice. I can still hear those words right there, we fly. That was the finest hour for me. Okay? I had survived the feat of the master. So anyway, that grounded all the missions, and I guess I'll have to speed this up. We got a whole hour. Anyway, within 2 months, that's when the fire occurred at the Cape of Apollo 1. So they grounded all the missions. 2 months later, a guy in North America ran a forklift through the guidance package of Apollo 4, which was a new package. 7-month delay, but they had to cancel a 200 series mission, which is a Saturn II, and mount that in Apollo 4 and then redo the trajectory. Good Lord. So we did it. Now, they also figured out that was the only game in town now. So they tasked us to see if we couldn't get some pictures of Earth from deep space. See, that's kind of a joke now. Deep space, 12,000 miles. This is whenever everything was a big deal in 200. We were going 12,000. So they want to know, can we get some pictures? Well, TRW management came and says, hey, we hope you're not going to get offended with this, but we've got to get a bunch of good mathematicians on this problem. Hope you don't mind. I said, no, I don't mind. But anyway, you're going to try to get mathematicians motivated, it takes forever. Okay? So as they were starting to get ready to commence to begin, to start to theorize how this even going to approach the problem, the guy with the pitchfork is me. I remember that as a kid I used to put models together, and that was I remember seeing a model down at Kmart. So Dan goes down and gets a Kmart model. And I said, I should be able to turn, if it's even possible, on any particular one. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. At least I can understand that one. So, I did a pitch yaw and roll over a pen and pencil set. Sure, none of the main windows was pointing that direction. But there's a little circular window down there, kept telling me that. And so I called the Cape, Boeing. I said, what's that little round window in there? He said, that's where an astrosextant goes. I said, we don't have, it's not going to be used. He said, what do you want to use it for? I said, I don't know. We might want to put a camera in there. If you'll give me the look angles, hold my body axis on that, maybe I can figure that out. So he sent them to me. So I programmed that up and then a mod to the trajectory program. Did what the look angles were to the Earth vector. And sure enough, the trace of the radius to the Earth went right through the window. So I was very enthusiastic, and I immediately called up and said, we can get them, we can get those pictures. TRW came down and says, what's this? How did you figure that out? Am I going to tell them I figured that out from a plastic model? No. I said, here's the proof of the pudding. You can look all you want to at that, and that does it. That's where the conversation ended, except for one thing, and they stole it. You better be right. Okay? After 48 years, nobody knows that that story except you guys, how that was done. So, at any rate, so every one of them has their day of reckoning. Our day of reckoning was November the 9th, 1967. Yeah. 7 o'clock in the morning. That was the instant time. I love this one because that's the instant time that there's just the engineering model at Apollo Saturn V #1 turned into a mission number Apollo 4. Excuse me. That one there, I love this one because it was the most powerful rocket that ever been built, and it's still that way today. Still is 50 years later at 8.5 million pounds of thrust. It's also made the loudest man-made noise of anything. I love this kind of stuff. It had a kill zone radius of about a mile away. Quarter of a mile, is what I really meant to say. It turned your brains into mush. Well, the fun part about this, it shattered the press booth on the Walter crankcase. So I love that kind of stuff. But at any rate, everything turned kind of serious because this one actually flew a secret mission. I mean, it's a perfect mission. It was absolutely perfect. I mean, it hit the numbers right to the third decimal place all the way around. Looking back, this is what caused us to leapfrog the Russians. We were ahead of them at this point in time with that launch. This was a gutsy launch. But what made it gutsy is the very first time you light the match, everything, the computer, everything, in all stages, everything got exercised for the first time, all at once. And everything worked perfect. Had this failed, we wouldn't be sitting here today. They would have killed that mission. I mean, Apollo in its entirety. They really would. So, but did we get her pictures from Earth? Yes, we did. There's what she looks like. All right. Now, they don't quite look like those pictures over here, does it? All right. That one do. The NASA picture was like this. I had about a 4-year-old son, and I took him to the Houston Space Museum down in Houston. He saw that picture like that. He went and talked to one of the guard guys. He says, the picture needs to go. I knew he was going to be a pretty good son at that point. Okay, but those are the originals. And you can see how it would trace right through the window. See, the framing on each one of them came in at the bottom and migrated out at the top. The one in the middle is exactly at 12,000 miles. I'm the only guy who knows that kind of picture. NASA's got one on either side of it, but they don't have that one. So anyway, that's my best story. So that was a fine moment for me. Okay, many years later, I'm in Winter, Oklahoma, mind my own business, sitting in the house, working, doing something. A guy named Dave Baker called me up, and he was calling from London. It kind of sounded familiar, but I didn't quite know who it was. And anyway, he says, I said, how'd you find me? He said, well, you wrote an article in a rocket magazine, and you left your your email and all that. He said, why are you calling me? He said, you remember that time whenever you was briefing Von Braun, Apollo 4? Yeah, why? He says, would you have another copy of that? He said, I would like to have one of them. Why is that? I said, yeah, I've got 2 of them. But why do you want it? He said, because that mission plan was not a NASA document. Okay? The name on that front cover was someone, a guy with a name and a face that didn't matter. Okay? That was mine. The signature page, you open it up, all it had was approval for the departments where I worked on TRW. It goes over to the Manned Spacecraft Center. The only guys that signed that one says, we got it. There was no other signature above the contracts guys. You get paid. He said, that's the only mission that ever flew without a NASA signature on it. And it probably stemmed from that first meeting when Von Braun, he was in charge. We're going to fly. You guys have no choice except to accept. He says, Dan and I agree. I love this kind of stuff. Okay? Yeah. So, that was clearly my finest hour, but I was well into retirement where it didn't matter if he talked about it. And yes, I said he earned a copy. Yes. Okay. So we want to talk about some daring things that went on. In fact, I don't talk about these that much. You had a really daring gamble. We saw that in Apollo 13 where you knew that. And that's where they blew the side out of it. But that wasn't the most daring. Apollo 8 was more like that. Remember, that one was the one that went around the moon. And it wasn't originally designed to prove the free return. They were reverting back, design a bit, test a bit. Then all of a sudden, the CIA comes back and says, we've detected the Russians rolling a very large rocket to the launch pad. What can you do about that? They changed the whole mission, Apollo 8, to go to the moon, to do the free return. That's it. Same way. Nothing had ever been tested before in Earth orbit or a compatibility test. Nothing. Here is the first spacecraft for the moon, and you can go use it. Get going. So that one there was pretty darn gutsy. Very cavalier. But we don't know how that one there turned out. It was very, very good. But the problem was, it did not have the lunar module in the spacecraft configuration that would land. Hey, you're just going to check her out, put it in orbit, and not do anything else. You're going to simulate failure on it, and then you're going to use it to come back. Okay, got it. Well, that didn't happen. So, they didn't have an alternate propulsion system like Apollo 13. If they'd had Apollo 13, it would have been signed arm. Those guys would have been gone. So this was very bold. So anyway, good successful mission. That put us right back, which takes us to Apollo 10, which is dress rehearsal for 11. That was actually done by a Gemini crew. Paul Stafford. He's an Okie. I don't know whether you know him or not. Okay? And so he was a really, really good guy. But that mission there he was the first one to actually operate in the lunar environment. But they were supposed to demonstrate that everything would work except for a landing. What they did, I guess they didn't trust Okies. What they ended up doing is they said, you got to descend around 9,000 feet, below 50,000 feet, and then abort and come on back up. They figured if he gave him a full load, the sucker would go ahead and land it. So they short fueled him. So you had to go aboard. And that one came back. So anyway, So he had a little problem as we came clear close to docking because he accidentally hit a switch and said, we're going to descend instead of go up, and then put it in some gyration and wanted to turn around and go back. His language got kind of colorful. That came down over all of the complex. Okay? So anyway, that's just a little aside. They had everything staffed that they needed staffed. Anyway, they decided that the guidance and navigation console would be in charge during the landing, and that they didn't really have any procedures for how they were going to do that. And so I was minding my own business one day, and he says, hey, we got a job for you. So they came to TRW, which then came to me. He says, the guys upstairs have been working on a guidance simulation piece of software where they model the guidance equations and all of the components of it, the accelerometers and the gyros and things like that. And so now you can put an error in it, fly the equations and see what happens. Okay? So I was supposed to take that one and do what they called a Monte Carlo analysis. Purpose of that is to run all the cases, let's just say an accelerometer. He's got a bias of some kind. Is that going to crash? He's going to fly out into oblivion? What's going to happen? So anyway, the idea of that was to find what kind of problematic situations would arise with whatever errors there might be in any of the components of the guidance package. Well, I ran hundreds of cases and hundreds of computer hours, all that. They actually moved me over on the third floor of Building 30 in Houston and gave me priority on anything that was going to run. Okay, so if I submitted a run, they'd kick somebody off. So it was just me and one technical person, and so the idea of this whole Monte Carlo analysis was to come up with the various signatures of an error that would show up on the plot boards, and also to define how the plot board should look, okay? So that you could see that signature and know where it was going. Well, you had to come up with a flight limit. Now this gets a little bit too darn technical, but I don't know any other way of explaining it, so I hope you'll pardon me for it. So the idea was, I was expected to go to NASA and brief every bit of this. But they says, no. All they wanted was a checklist. Just tell them, don't bother me about things that don't matter. What don't matter? Well, if it's not going to kill somebody, it don't matter. Okay? All right? So I did not brief it. So that's the reason why I got this little thing here. They put that barrier up. Said, well, we can have him in the auxiliary control room during the landing, just in case. Oh, okay, I guess that works. So they got my ticket to go in there. So here's what happened. July the 20th, the Eagle had landed. Everybody remembers where they were at that time. How many people don't know where they were at that particular time? Nobody. Yeah, see, this is kind of like a big deal. The banks are closed. Schools suspended classes. Stock markets quit trading. Government offices are closed. I mean, it was just a complete sweep, regardless of what country you were in. The eyes of every nation was focused on Apollo to see what was going to happen. And the world waited with guarded anticipation. You didn't know whether who was going to be enemy or not. I think everybody had some fixed emotions. Well, I hope they crash. No, I hope they get it done. Kind of a deal. So I know where I was. I was back here at this building right back here. That's in Houston, in the third floor. I was not in this mission control room. I was in the actual auxiliary control room next door. See? This was the very first all mission, NASA mission. It was part of the control. Up until that time, it was mostly contractors. They were in the control center. They said, hey, no, this is the reason we're here. It's got to be a NASA show. Okay, good, I understand that, got it. So, we off to the auxiliary control room we went. At T-minus 30 minutes, 30 minutes before it would emerge from the backside of the moon. See, once it went behind the moon, there was no communication. It would come around, and now we're ready to land. So we had about 30 minutes before we would see it. At T-minus 30, there was this call for silence. And I thought they were going to say a little prayer or something. No, that is not what this was about. I mentioned that Marine, okay? He knew what he was doing. What he did, he says, all right, I want some silence. He says, the doors to this room is now locked. In fact, the doors to the building is locked. The elevators ain't gonna work. There's no entry or exit allowed. You guys here are for the duration. You got one thing to do, and that's the job you've been trained to do. Now get her done. Whatever happens, happens. Either we crash, we land, or whatever. I'll defend whatever decisions you guys make. What a thing to say. The more I thought about it, the more brilliant that was. After all, the whole world didn't expect us to get this done. Nobody did. Absolutely nobody. But here it is at the moment of landing. That's what it looked like on the other side of the wall from me. That was at 2:17 p.m. Central Standard Time. Yeah. This is kind of what happened. This is where NASA didn't really want to know the full answer. Kind of bit of a look. We went on the backside of the moon. It was in circular orbit, but they went to separate it out. The lander went on this elliptical where we returned back to the same spot. So there was this decision point for about where they are now to say go ahead and ignite the engine, go ahead and descend. Well, that's when all hell broke loose. Everything went nuts. Because to explain what happened, the guidance package, look at this one, this yellow line, it flew a fixed profile. It did not fly to a point. Okay? It always flew, it always thought everything was nominal. So it's a little hard to grasp, but they didn't know what you were going to tell us, where you're going to expect to land, so MIT just designed a constant profile. Well, if you were downrange, the whole thing would shift. The whole picture would shift. Well, that's exactly what happened. We came around, and here it showed up about 8 minutes early. Okay? And so it was downrange. And so from what they had to look at, we were comparing a primary guidance with an auxiliary or a backup guidance. Those are strictly inputs from the accelerometers and stuff like that. So that told you where you were. Well, it was plotting this profile, and it looked fine. That looked fine. But you also looked at that against the ground tracking. That's where things were not right at all. So now you had these limit lines on there, and one of them was crowding that limit line, and the guidance guy was getting a little on the panicky side. Hey. Here's a classic case of air traffic control. The guy that's on the ground, he wants to look at his radars, his ground tracking. The guy in the airplane, he wants to believe his instruments. See, I was the guy that I didn't care about how it compared to ground tracking. Didn't care. The two guidance packages agreed entirely. They're happy with this. The guys on board are not griping about it. Leave it alone. Okay? And so that kind of went on. So one thing leads to another. So he left it alone. We ended up with a computer alarm, which they panicked. It was an overload situation. Nobody knew what it was. And the other guys in the ACR was IBMers. They knew what it was. There was an overload. Well, nothing wrong, guys. There's nothing wrong with that. It simply says shedding data. If you're overloading it, you're doing something that's not essential. Well, done something that was not essential, Buzz Aldrin punching in, give me a digital readout. His job was to give readouts to Armstrong as they were coming down, and he was too panicked to read analog. He now says, stop what you're doing, give me a readout so I can tell it. NASA covered that one up after the thing was over and said, well, he had the rendezvous radar was on, and that was kind of putting in a lot of stuff. No. It don't work that way. You don't have a computer trying to land and descend at the same time. No. So that's the story that's left out. It's not going to crash. It's just going to process every other data, every third piece of information. It might get a little jerky, but it ain't going to crash. IBM knew that, and they said, leave it alone. Okay. So anyway, that was a little tough sledding there for a while. But at any rate, we had several, and in the main control room says abort. Question mark. The guys in the ACR says, no, let it go. Okay, fine. Okay, we'll let it go. These guys down here says, oh, we didn't know anything about how IBM built their computer, but anyway, this is an IBM issue down here that said continue. So anyway, that is that. So, main question I'm always asked, what was it like being there? What were you feeling at the time? Everybody wants to know about your feelings. Okay? Well, all right, you ask, I'll tell you. As soon as it landed, I felt a great hollow feeling. Something like a lead weight in my stomach. I had a great sense of disappointment, but I didn't understand at the time. Best way I can describe it is like Charlie Coyote. Everybody knows Charlie Coyote, right? Where the bird, the prize stops, and I just keep right on going. It's a long ways to the bottom. What I was actually feeling was the adventure I was on was overdone, finito kaput. The race was done. It was over. Victory was at hand. There's nothing more to be done. The book had been written. Anybody can do this now. What am I going to do now? The romance of all of it was gone. Just like it didn't help a great deal to find out those guys that were celebrating so hard in that room had flunked the course before the launch, the day before the launch. So now I understood why that Marine made the words he said. And I knew why the purpose for the auxiliary control room. So I don't know what would have happened to that mission without the, anyway, that's that. So Apollo 11 and the trajectory reconstruction showed it was about 18 miles off the mark. That put a new mission objective on Apollo 12 because it's showing a fixed profile. Says, how are we going to land in some rough territory if we can't control where it lands? He said, we're going to have, that's the end of the lunar missions if we can't find a way of getting a precision landing. And they said, well, I tell you what, there's a fairly sizable crater out there that has a little surveyor. A surveyor was a reconnaissance lander as we were checking for landing sites. One of the big precursors to it. If you can land next to a surveyor, I might believe you. I still have a memo from the NASA guy who says we're going to be lucky to land within a mile of that surveyor. Because the scheme we came up to says, oh, if we can measure the residuals as it comes around the backside of the moon, there's a scale factor in front of every equation. We might be able to put a little computer program together that says, oh, here's the inverse of what we can do to put it back on course. In other words, send up some lies to the guidance to make it steer the way you want to. That's all we could come up with. So that's what we did. So the gutsiest guy there was didn't want to cancel the program. His name was Pete Conrad. He's the guy that had the little space in his teeth. Neat guy, neat good guy. He actually did a hands-off landing. That's gutsy. That's gutsy. Sure enough, we had that same problem coming around the moon. It was downrange, just like always. He did a hands-off. First words out of his mouth, he says, we're about 25 feet in front of the surveyor crater. He says, I can see it from here. There he is. That's the lander on the edge of the crater, and he's walking down there to where the lander is. I love this one. I'm going to frame that little memo one of these days. But anyway, that was also a finest moment for me, as you might imagine. The most successful failure was Apollo 13. Now, I don't need to tell you a whole lot about this one, because you've seen that movie a dozen times. And that's pretty accurate all the way across. See, the problem was once we got on this translunar thing, that's where they blew out the side of that service module. Well, that put it way out here. And if left alone, it would have gone heliocentric. It would have been around in orbit around the sun. So the deal was to find out where is the window within the fuel reserves of the lander where you can do a maneuver and put it back on this free return. That was the drill. That's the part they left out of the movie. Okay. But that's what we did. We used a descent engine, the manual procedure with some star locks, and it got her done. The story I want to tell you is something you don't know. So over in Australia, they had a bad feeling about this mission from the very beginning. All you had to do is kind of look at the mission patch, and it looks like the horses of Armageddon. They seem to spell disaster. It really does. She says, these guys here, they started a prayer chain, to put it that way. They talked to the ancient ones, the ones that came before. They built fires all over Western Australia. The whole Aboriginal community had set fires and doing the prayers for Apollo 13. Yeah. Yeah, for those guys. So I thought that was one of the neatest stories to come out of the space program in its entirety. This is the day that I think NASA stood up on their hind legs and became NASA. They didn't need us much more anymore than that. Graduation day, always happens. Okay. No more about the rest of the mission because those are going to some of the higher latitudes and but boys will be boys. What they were focusing on there is a plane. Yeah. One thing about it, everybody was worried about how cumbersome the suit was. Well, he's playing some hockey. He's up there on the moon. He's doing some dancing. He lost it, but he managed to get back up again. These guys here are doing a jig and doing a fine job of it. This guy here was he hit a golf ball. So it became kind of a frivolous program after this, you see. People quit watching. Catting around with the cart, instead of doing his business, he was having fun with it. This one here I love, it shows him drinking beer on the That's obviously not a real picture. Okay. But the fun part was also on the ground. This here is a immigration form that they gave Neil Armstrong and those guys to sign on their entry back on Apollo 11. I thought that was pretty cool. All right, so you want to know how the race was won? I know. Yeah. There's the two. There's the two. There's the Russian one. There's the Saturn V. They're almost identical. Turns out, you pencil it out, you got the same answer. About 8.5 million pounds of thrust is what you need. Okay, how are we going to get there? Von Braun says, I think I'm not going to use any existing engines. I'm going to have to go build my own. So he tries to build the F1 engine, 1.5 million pounds of thrust apiece. So what he decided to do was build a large thrust engine in a small cluster. 5 engines. The Russians, I don't think Korolev would have ever done this on his own. I think it was a Politburo said, look, you've got some perfectly good engines on the Vostok. Those produce about 200,000 pounds of thrust. Making use of them. Well, they began to cluster. This is what it looked like. This ring comes in clusters of 6. He's got 30 engines clustered together. Can you imagine synchronizing those things? You guys could never balance 2 carburetors on your Chevrolet in 1950 or 60. And these guys were trying to do it with 30. It ain't gonna work. It just doesn't work. On July the 5th of that same year, they knew when we were going to launch. So they tried to launch that thing to beat us there. It got about 1,000 foot off the ground at a very inopportune point in time and blew to smithereens. It completely wiped Baikonur off the map of the Earth. Along with it was 135 key personnel, along with some military ones. Its debris was over 60 miles in radius. So how was the race was won? To borrow a verse from the scripture. It says the end was declared from the beginning. As soon as they took the pencil in hand and says, we're going to go this way, the race was over. It was a done deal. Nothing else mattered. There never was a race in reality. Yet we were pouring money at it like crazy. We could have taken our time. We could have not taken the risks that we took. We could have, if we'd only known. But we knew we were ahead of when the Saturn V Apollo 4 went off the pad. And it was fine. It was perfectly successful. They were still shooting the Vostoks. We knew we were ahead at that point. So anyway, that's it. Now, if you want to get appreciation for the size of that, here is the state of Oklahoma. There's the debris field as if the launch pad was sitting there in Oklahoma City. So it was spreading debris all the way from Lawton to Palmer City, from Enid down to Pauls Valley, Henrietta to Weather. In our direction, it was raining down, and it would have been raining down in Watauga. That's how big that was. Its explosive power was greater than Fat Man or Little Man of the two atomic bombs that we laid on Japan. Yeah. Yeah. So, that's never been resurrected, and I don't think they're going to do anything about it. Compare kind of what the Russians did versus what Apollo did, as I put this map together, where the red is the Russians. They sort of stayed out on the perimeter. They were in the, put the unmanned rovers together. They had no manned anything. Okay? Everything was unmanned. Apollo, we put some landers. These were the reconnaissance ones. So you can see where some of them were like, we were landing next to the Apollo 12. There it is, next to the photographic lander. So the Russians stuck to the highlands more than any place else, but they did a lot of work on the backside with orbital stuff, and I think they probably landed some back there too. We're going to find out about that, I think, before this next decade is out. The Americans stuck to the equatorial plane, and mostly the smooth places. See, that explains why we stuck to the wide, smooth areas, because we knew the fixed profile. So anyway, we also did the Mare and a kind of one or two highlands. This is Lindro, and I think that is Hagganis. At any rate, we also did some orbital recon and mapping and some geographic sampling. We left quite a bit of stuff behind. Every one of them landed had a cadre of stuff. Put another seismometer here. Put this, put there, and let her go. It's interesting to record that one of the first things the Russians ever put down was these rovers. Those darn things are still working. These are not a bunch of grunting cavemen that didn't know what they were doing. Ours didn't last that long. Okay? In fact, some of them, this isn't what they look like. This one here shouldn't be still working if you wanted to awaken it. They just got tired of messing with it. That's over 12, 14, 15 years operating. The Americans, this is what our spacecraft looked like. This is the surveyors that did the reconnaissance work. This one here is the one we put the manned landers in it. There's the little car. Every little kid would love to have one, and we left every car back there. I mean, we were littering the place up real bad. Yeah. So a lot of fun, and let's go back. How much gold is on there? Yeah. Yes. So, Apollo had a way of testing people. And I want to start with von Braun. Every once in a while, it tests the metal, M-E-T-T-L-E. Okay? I learned of his full name here just in the process of putting this briefing together. You can tell by his name that he was born of royalty, but he was a gifted engineering genius even before the government began to pay attention to him. When they did pay attention to him, they said, "You're going to head up the Nazi rocket program. Oh, by the way, here is your SS card." He didn't join. Anybody who was in charge of anything significant in the German army was SS. So he was going to head up the whole rocket program at Mundi up there on the Black Sea. So he actually wanted to build rockets to go to the moon, or do space stuff. He didn't want them to rain down on Britain at all. He was arrested twice. One by the SS themselves and by Gestapo for dragging his feet. He was shipping rocketry south at the same time that they were launching stuff out of Punamindi on England. When the Russians started showing up, that's whenever the SS became a real plus. He loaded the trucks up along with around 1,200 and some of his best guys and headed south where the rockets were. He'd come to a roadblock and he says, out of the way, I'm SS. You guys don't report anything. We're getting stuff out of here. That's what got him through. He actually knew that's where we were coming from. And some of the best thrust we had, and he surrendered to the U.S. forces down there. And sure enough, we had conveniently all of those V-2s snatched away in some caverns and places like that. The U.S. Congress saw it differently. Well, he's a damn old Nazi. He's SS. He did this, he did that. He used slave labor. None of that was his choice. None of that. Okay? When you're thrust, you were born where you were born. When you were selected or else. He just did what he was supposed to do with whatever was given to him. He made a feeble effort at it all the time, channeling off his best work elsewhere. We never forgave him for that. See? Even the program director, Sam Phillips, admitted he did not think that the U.S. could ever reach the moon at all without Werner von Braun. And I believe he's entirely correct on that score. Unfortunately, the way the Congress and everybody else handled him, he's only received token recognition. He's had a dozen or more honorary PhDs conferred on him as if he needed another one. Did the university more good for their image than it did for him. He had a few plaques and medals and civic funding. After Apollo was over, he was named as the National Science Director for Nixon. Nixon fired him over the shuttle. He says, not good. That'll never be anything except a dollar. So, unfortunately, we named the Manned Spacecraft Center after Lyndon Johnson. The guy that had the least contribution to anything. Absolutely not. So he gets recognition, but von Braun does not. Okay, but I guess that's the American way. Only politicians get stuff named after them. At the beginning of this, I mentioned that I'd come back to this one. In the beginning, von Braun had a direct approach to this, the same as the Russians. Just fly in, target it, get it straight on. Caused a big controversy when one of the engineers came up with the lunar orbit option. Big controversy. Well, von Braun actually conceded to the youngest engineer he had that the lunar orbit rendezvous was the right way to go. That took something to do. Most people at that stature, with that kind of responsibility, that high up on the ladder would say, shut down and shut up, do your job. He thought about it, he was agonized over it, and he agreed with it. 2 thumbs up on that. I admire the man greatly for that. What did he say about the shuttle? That's my take on it. It's a big joke. The original hype labeled that as the Lamborghini of the space program. My older brother, Chip, he knows about this one. Because they were trying to sell this to the Air Force. Turned out, instead of being a Lamborghini, it was a Detroit Lemon. It's rejected by the U.S. Air Force. And also, the Russians had the plans. They built one that says, forget it. It's in a junk heap in one of the kids' playground in Moscow. But it's going to be cheap and economical. No. Getting her built was grossly over budget. Grossly over, by orders of magnitude. And it was also extremely expensive to operate and maintain. That's what caused 2 bad decisions, maybe 3. NASA management in flying the shuttle. They labeled that as a workhorse of space. We can fly one every day. We can reuse it. I don't think so. Had a very limited payload. It could carry only a fourth of what the Saturn V could do. Couldn't get more than 200 miles out. It couldn't reach today's space station. That's the reason why we leased Russian stuff to do it. It was even less capable than the best Gemini spacecraft launch vehicle. The workhorse of space? No. Reusable? No. It started out trying to retrieve everything, little by little, everything dropped all out of that equation and dumped it in the sea. Only when the disk burned was that reusable, but it took a complete refurb to do it. Now, highly flexible, low Earth only, very feeble lifting capability. It never found a purpose, but yet we hyped it and hyped it and hyped it to the American public until you got sick of it. Von Braun was right. That's what he tried to tell Nixon. And he says, oh no, you're fired. You can't get with the program, you're fired. This one I love. We're getting to the really good parts here. Some of the measures of men, this is a picture, the only one that I know that Neil took. Everything else is, every picture is out of Buzz. Notice where the flag is. Awfully close to that lander. What's going to happen when you leave and you light that asset engine? You can almost see the body language. Neil, you got this right? Then along came a president called Nixon. Look at this plaque. You'll find copies of these in the exhibits. You might look at them. And you'll see what he's got is, we are going to tell them who we were and all that kind of stuff. You guys are going to sign it. It says here, the Richard M. Nixon, President of the United States of America. It had nothing to do with the entire program. He turned it from mankind and into a man. He did it so he could blow his own whistle. Irks me to death. I don't like it. He did that on all of the advancements. He planted that flag exactly where he wanted to plant it. He says, look, I'm a good soldier. The guy's got that plaque over there. He's my commander-in-chief. I'm going to do what he tells me to do. I'm going to plant it. So he planted exactly where he wanted it planted. He got the last word because it's the only flag that still is not standing. I love it. He had the wherewithal to do the thing and try to return it back to the purity at which it began. I love that. So at any rate, along comes around 2007, a friend of mine, his name is Buck Fletcher. He's my high school friend. He had a business in New York City, and he had spent some time in Russia. He called me up one day, and he said, hey, on Apollo 11, did they do anything about the Russians? I don't know. I did a little research on it, and here's what I found out. Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott on Apollo 15 were real good buddies. About the same kind of buddies that the two Russian guys had. By the way, does anybody got his book, Neil's book? No? You saw the movie, right? Yeah? Okay. I had to buy that book to see whether this was true. And yes, there's more truth in it than I realized. Anyway, so on with it. He got there on the moon. Before he left, get back into them. And see, Buzz did not know this. Buzz Aldrin did not know he was going to do this. Only these two guys knew what was going to happen. He left a patch for the 3 guys we burned up on Apollo 1. Going to honor them. He left a gold piece for the We Came in Peace deal, and he left that commemorative coin. I have that one. That's in the case up here too. And he put another one together here, was stylized what the Russian spacecraft looked like with a little inscription on it, because they didn't know what it was. But nevertheless, it's the heart thing that made the difference to me. So all this here is for the Russians. And so these are the only ones we knew that died in the pursuit of space. The only ones. Dave Scott, several on the advanced program, he did something else. He researched it. Now he had 14 people who lost their life. Some of them were American, some of them were Russian. We only knew about 2. So he had a plaque put together in remembrance. And he had this stylized fallen astronaut he left on the surface. What's kind of strange about that one, it wasn't made in the US of A. It was made in Belgium. Both these guys were pretty disappointed in our leadership. Neil Armstrong, the man of destiny. He's gone. He was one of the guys, he was a test pilot, and he was clearly the right stuff. He wouldn't even change expression, whatever happened. He was in the hypersonic stuff that really actually kind of go out of Earth's atmosphere. And I was driving by Ellington Air Force Base one time, and I saw something crash over there. I didn't know what it was. I didn't go in there because I knew he couldn't get in there. So I said, "What's that?" Well, that was Neil Armstrong testing out a pogo type bed frame that had the rocket thing there to understand how you can land her. He boarded that out of that within 1 second of it being. He would have lost his life, let's put it that way. He was back to work the next morning. What are we going to do today, guys? Well, he was a very private guy. He was admired by almost everybody in the astronaut corps. He was kind of hard to figure. Very unshakable, as I tried to kind of point out with him. He avoided the press. He absolutely couldn't stand them. They were always trying to ask stupid questions. He hated it. But he's also the most highly decorated. He didn't like that either. Why you keep trying to give me stuff? Why are you guys trying to make a hero out of me? He never sought fame or anything else like that. He's the only guy that I've been able to read about that left things on the moon and never brought anything back. It was the opposite for everybody else. Most astronauts had pockets full of stuff to go to the moon and says, "Okay, I'm going to sell this when I get home," because it took the trip. No. Neil had none of that in his mind, ever. Ever. The only thing he wanted to be is an aeronautical engineer. That's exactly what he was. And he went back to his hometown, and that's what he was doing. Turns out, an aeronautical engineer supposed to know about airplanes, actually took the best rock samples, did the best documentation of anybody on any of the flights who actually had geologists involved. I know that's kind of slick. So anyway, in these books, he did leave things behind. That validated that one, but there was more than that. He actually left something for his daughter. So, one thing I like about him, he scolded Congress pretty hard toward the end of his life. Because he said, "Why are you guys trying to honor me like this? They got about over 600,000 people, 400. You haven't said thanks to nobody. You just keep trying to lay everything on me. Stop it. He was so private, he wanted to be buried at sea. Nobody knew when the funeral was. That was around 2012. There was no public funeral whatsoever. And I got to put a kind of a little obituary together for him at that time. It was out at Black Mesa at an astronomy deal. And I knew then that he was en route to be buried at sea. All right, we're down here to the last. All right, you want to know what's good to come out of this thing? Well, America got a short fuse. People start griping. They don't have instant results. It's kind of like the chicken and the egg deal. Well, what's that good for? It's kind of like that enterprise of the wheel. Keep it around a while, something comes out of it. Now, what's that good for? It takes a while for it to take root. Well, okay, you mean kind of like these sequoias that's got one of these. You dig around for a while, wait a while, you're going to get a whole forest out of this. It ain't going to be like tomorrow. It ain't going to be like next week. About a year from now, it's going to start bringing. So that's kind of the way you need to judge this as an enterprise. Some of the offspring of Apollo is it's got some of these, like the memory foam that you sleep on, you sit on. Accordance tools you got laying around, all battery operated, rechargeable. Those transition sunglasses that you won't leave alone. Dust busters, yeah, all that little stuff. On a bigger scale, yeah, you've got a fuel cell or heart monitors, solar panels, freeze-dried food that you thrive on. Let me ask you, how many of you's got a can of WD-40? Yeah? That's the very first product that came out of the space program. And that was something to lubricate the fuel pumps on an Atlas missile. Because that turned at 80,000 RPM and there wasn't anything that was going to hold up to it. So that's become now in everybody's bottom drawer in the garage and also the kitchen. Good for burns and all whatever have you. Everybody's got one. But anyway, you went from that down to a digital world. How did you get from there? Well, I think we would probably be still having computers, maybe only a few corporations have them. First thing we did was miniaturize electronics. Get her small, get her small. That's what laid the computers, the PCs, all that in made that possible. You couldn't go around just programming hard language in it. You had to develop a higher order language in order for that to work. It also had to respond to high real-time events instead of just sit there and do batch processing. We can't live without those things today. So the software design methodologies, and the same thing happened in telecommunications. You got a cell phone, don't you? Yeah. Yeah. Apollo gave you that. Yeah. So it came down with the miniaturization, then it went to the calling and the cameras and all that stuff. But the remote imaging, yeah, that's where your CAT scans and your MRIs came from. Yeah. We learned how to do simulation and predictive analysis. That's how you did a Monte Carlo analysis now on almost everything. So anyway, we ended up with new materials, manufacturing process, and a whole new world of a college curriculum. Up until this time, you could not take a course in any of these. Where I went to school at Norfolk, they had one, and I had a course. I went back to Oklahoma State, they had none. Many years later, 4 or 5, they start dabbling in it. So there was a lot of catch-up in the academic world. But now everybody does it. See? So that's enough of that. So I can tell you, every one of those is like the seedling that sprung into a whole new industry, a whole set of occupations, whole set of brand new products, and expanded education, and every one of them had a hand in changing the world. That's the reason why I say, you take what these things have done, I don't think there's anything in the history of the world that's made a larger impact. I think here today, you're going to find out those eggs are going to hatch. They've already hatched, and they keep on hatching. Derivatives of those keep producing new ones. And more, and more, and more. That one right there is probably your next generation. That's kind of the way it works. That's exactly what's happened here. You just can't say it produced this and that was the end of the story. That seed is just creating a whole forest of product. Okay, this is my next to last chart. Let's go back to the beginning. And the very first lunar mission was done by Neil Armstrong. The very last lunar mission was done by Eugene Cernan. One of the things that Neil said, we came in peace for all mankind. Gene picked it up, we leave in the same as we came, but with hope for all mankind. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Which is to say, what began in fear ended in hope.